If you've ever opened a Bible and wondered where you are, this episode is for you. One of my earliest memories of being handed part of a Bible goes back to 5th grade in Groveport, Ohio. I grew up in central Ohio in the 1970s, and one afternoon our class was dismissed into the hallway. We walked in the line, past a table, and each one of us was handed a small red book, not much bigger than the palm of my hand. It wasn't the whole Bible. It contained the New Testament along with Psalms and Proverbs. At the time, I didn't really know much about who provided it or why, but years later, I learned it was part of the Gideon school distribution program. I remember that little red book itself more than I remember understanding what was in it. And looking back, I think that may be a useful place for us to begin today. Because a lot of people first encounter the Bible in that manner. Someone hands them one. There's one sitting on a shelf at home. They find one in a hotel room. Or today, maybe they download a Bible app onto their phone. But nobody necessarily explains what they're actually holding. So before we talk very much about how to read the Bible, perhaps we ought to begin with an even more basic question. What exactly is this thing? Welcome to Unmarked Trail, approaching the Bible with fresh eyes. My name is Don Hornsby. And if you're curious about the Bible, but you're not quite sure how to approach it, you're in the right place. You don't need a church background. You don't need to know the vocabulary. You don't need to know the church speak. You don't have to arrive with all the answers. Just come curious. In the first episode, I talked about 3 things I wish someone had told me when I first began reading the Bible seriously. The Bible isn't always easy to read. It isn't always clear. And you shouldn't simply take someone else's word for what it says, including mine. Read it for yourself. But if you're going to read it for yourself, it helps to have a map. So today, let's get familiar with the territory. One of the first things worth knowing is that the Bible is not really one kind of book. It's more like a library. One library with many kinds of writing. That's the language we'll use on the Unmarked Trail study card. And I think it's a helpful way to think about it. Once you begin to understand what's in that library, the Bible starts to feel a little less intimidating. If you have a Bible, you might want to pick one up now. If not, continue. Now, most Bibles are divided into 2 large sections: the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, we'll use those terms now, but later we'll learn some other terms for those 2 large sections. Now, the Old Testament comes first. It contains the foundational story of ancient Israel, along with law, history, poetry, wisdom, and the writings of the prophets. Then the New Testament begins with the story of Jesus and continues into the life of the early church of the first century, including letters written to early church communities, and finally, the book of Revelation. Now that's the broadest map. But there's another way of looking at the Bible that I think is even more helpful when you're learning how to read it. So instead of thinking only in terms of Old Testament and New Testament, begin noticing the different kinds of writing that you are encountering. Because genre matters. Context matters. Now, by genre, I simply mean the kind of writing that you're reading. Is it a story? Is it a poem? Is it a letter? Is it a prophecy? Is it a vision? Different kinds of writing communicate in different ways. And by context, I mean what surrounds the passages that you're reading. What comes before it? What comes after it? Who is speaking? Who are they speaking to? What was happening at the time? These questions alone can keep us from making a lot of mistakes. So not every part of the Bible should be read the same way. So let's walk through the library, shall we? Number 1, the Torah or the Law. Now the first 5 books of the Bible are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Together they form the foundational story and instruction of Israel. Genesis begins with creation and moves through the stories of people that you might be familiar with: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Exodus tells the story of Israel leaving Egypt. And as we continue, we will encounter laws, covenant instructions, worship practices, and the formation of a people. So even within these first 5 books, you're encountering more than one kind of writing. You're reading story, and then you're reading law, and that matters. A story about Abraham in Genesis is doing something very different than a command that you'll read in Leviticus. And they sit beside each other in the Bible, but they aren't the same kind of writing. The second set that we will see is history. We come to books such as Joshua, Judges, Samuel. There are 2 of them, 1st and 2nd. Kings, again 2 of them, 1st and 2nd. Chronicles, again 2 of them, 1st and 2nd. Then you have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These books tell the story of Israel's life, their leaders, their failures, and their victories. And here's something worth remembering when you read biblical history. Telling you what happened is not always the same as telling you what should happen. The Bible sometimes describes people doing some very terrible things. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the writer is recommending their behavior. So when you're reading a story, pay attention not only to what people do, pay attention to how the story itself presents what they do. Sometimes the point of the story is precisely that something has gone terribly wrong. In our third set, we have poetry and wisdom. These are books such as Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, sometimes it's referred to. Now, these contain prayers, songs, questions, and reflection on the human experience. And this is some of the most deeply human writing in the Bible, and some of my favorite. There is joy, there's grief, there's anger, there is praise alongside of questions of confusion, and there are questions that don't get neat answers. If you ever read one of the Psalms and thought, well, that sounds like something a real person would say, that's part of its power. Poetry gives people language for experience, and wisdom literature asks questions such as, how should we live? What makes a life good? Why do bad things happen? What can we know? What can't we know? And again, genre matters. For you see, a proverb is not necessarily a legal guarantee. And poetry will often use imagery, and sometimes it's exaggerated, and sometimes it's a metaphor. You shouldn't read Psalms the same way you read Kings, and you shouldn't read Proverbs the same way you read Leviticus. Now we come to our fourth category, the prophets. We come to books such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the books sometimes called the minor prophets. They're not called minor prophets because they're less important. They're simply shorter books. The word prophet can make people immediately think about predicting the future, like Nostradamus. And there are certainly passages in the prophets that look forward. But the prophets were also speaking into their own moment. They spoke about warning. There was hope, justice, restoration. They addressed real people in real historical situations. So one of the first questions to ask when reading a prophet is, what was happening when this was said? You might want to ask other questions such as, who was being addressed? Or, what was going on politically? Or, what was going on socially? And perhaps the most important one, what was going on spiritually? You might want to consider and ask, what problem was the prophet confronting? These questions will give you the kind of context that can change the way you understand an entire passage. Now we come to a fifth category, the Gospels. Now, this is part of the big collection, the second big collection, which we know as the New Testament. Again, we'll discuss different ways of viewing it rather than calling it the New Testament. But be that as it may, the Gospels would be number 5. There are 4 books in this collection: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They tell us about the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But even here, there's something important to notice. The 4 Gospels tell the story of Jesus from different angles, and they emphasize different details, and they sometimes arrange the material differently. That doesn't have to be a problem. In fact, paying attention to those differences can help us understand what each writer especially wants us to notice about Jesus. And later on this season, we're going to take one of those Gospels and we're going to read it together. We're going to start with Mark. I look forward to that. The 6th category would be Acts and the letters. So after the Gospels comes this book of Acts. Acts tells the story of the early movement of the followers of Jesus Christ after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then comes the letters. Now, these are letters that are written by a variety of people. Paul. Others are associated with names such as James, Peter, John, and Jude. And when I say letters, they are exactly that. Letters. You might hear the word epistles. I invite you to look at them as letters. They were written to actual people and communities facing actual circumstances. So when you read one, it's helpful to ask, who is writing? Is it Peter? Is it Paul? Is it John? You might want to ask, who are they writing to? A group of people in the town of Corinth? A group of people in Ephesus? You might want to ask, what seems to be happening? Another question: what question or problems are they addressing? Reading a letter without asking these questions can be a little like opening someone else's mail halfway through the conversation. Now, you could still learn a great deal, but you have to admit, context helps. And finally, we come to number 7, Revelation. Now, Revelation contains some vivid imagery, conflict, hope, and a final renewal. It belongs to a kind of writing often called apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic writing communicates differently from a straightforward historical account or a narrative or a personal letter. It's going to be using symbols, images, visions, strange creatures, numbers, and cosmic scenes. And if we read all of that as though every image were simply a photograph of a future event, we may miss what the imagery itself is trying to communicate. Revelation is a very good example of why understanding genre matters. Now, none of these 7 categories answer every question. Some books contain more than one kind of writing, and people sometimes organize the books of the Bible differently, and that's all right. This isn't meant to be a perfect academic classification. It's a map, something simple enough to help you find your bearings. And if you remember only 3 things from this episode, remember these. The Bible is a library. Genre matters. Context matters. Not every part of the Bible should be read the same way. You don't read a poem the way you read a letter. You don't read a law the way you read a story. You don't read Revelation the way you read Mark. And once you begin noticing those differences, the Bible becomes a little easier to navigate. The trail starts to become more familiar. I've also put together a simple Unmarked Trail study card to go with this episode. On one side is a map of the Bible, the 7 broad sections we just walked through. On the other side are simple habits for reading the Bible well. And at the bottom are 3 questions we're going to come back to again and again. Number 1, what does it say? That's simply observing. Number 2, what does it mean? How do we interpret it? And number 3, what should I do, think, or feel as a result of what it says and what it means? How do I respond to it? Now, these 3 essential questions can help us approach the text with clarity. It helps us to slow down, to pay attention, and to understand what we are reading. They're simply a way of slowing ourselves down. And slowing down is usually a good thing when we're reading something ancient, we're reading something important, and sometimes difficult to read. And if you like a copy of the Unmarked Trail study card, send me a note at hello@unmarkedtrail.org. That's, again, hello@unmarkedtrail.org. And I'll be glad to send one your way. There's another line on that card that I especially want to emphasize. Read it yourself. Teachers can help. Books can help. Commentaries can be helpful. Other readers can help. And responsible readers will sometimes disagree. And that conversation can sharpen our reading. But don't simply take someone else's word for what the Bible says, including mine. Open it. Look. Ask questions. Notice what's actually there. That's what we're trying to learn to do together. In the next episode, we'll take the next step. Now that we have a basic map of the Bible, how do we actually read a passage well? We'll talk more about context. We'll talk more about genre. We'll talk about observation. And also, most importantly, what to do when something doesn't make sense. If you have a question, or if there's a passage you would like to explore sometime, you can reach me at hello@unmarkedtrail.org. I'll be glad to hear from you. And if this episode has been helpful and you know someone else who might appreciate it, I'd be grateful if you shared it with them. Maybe they have a Bible somewhere. Maybe someone gave them one years ago. Maybe it's sitting on a shelf. Maybe they've downloaded an app. And maybe they're simply curious and don't quite know where to begin. If so, invite them along. You don't have to belong anywhere to be here. Just come curious. I'm glad you're here. This is Unmarked Trail. Let's keep walking.